Okay, so I think we are now recording. Welcome everyone to the last colloquium of the fall semester. My name is Charles Chang. I'm the chair of the colloquium committee here at BU Linguistics with Megan Brown and Jenya Lukin, who are the other organizers. And I'm not going to say very much, just to welcome everyone to the last colloquium. And I'll turn things over to Professor Kopic to introduce our speaker for today.
All right. It is a great honor to be welcoming Jessica Rett to our Linguistics Department Colloquium series. I first met Professor Rett in 2014 for a conference on the meaning of superlative modifiers like at most and at least in a castle in the middle of the Dutch countryside. So that was an auspicious beginning to our relationship, and I've been a big fan of hers ever since. Jessica Rett hails from beautiful UCLA, where she serves as Director of Graduate Admissions and Vice Chair of the Linguistics Department, while maintaining an active research program in semantics, pragmatics, and philosophy of language. She has made insightful and important contributions on a variety of semantic topics, especially in the realm of degree semantics, including quantity words like many, the semantics of positive form adjectives like tall and other constructions that she labels evaluative, manner implicatures in general, which play a role in the semantics of positive form adjectives, equatives and similatives, mirativity and evidentiality, and exclamatives, which we will be hearing about today. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing more cool work from Jessica Rett. Please join me in welcoming her today.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks for the lovely introduction. Liz, I hope we get to hang out in a castle again soon. That was epic. So I'm trying today to give a little bit of stuff for everyone. So try and make sure that everyone has something that they can sort of latch onto and be interested in. But that sort of means that at some point I'll be talking outside of my area of expertise. I may or may not have a co-author, my co-author joining me, either for the talk or the Q&A. I don't see her here yet. But suffice to say, I will do my best to help with as much of the prosody, which is not my area of expertise, as I can. As I sort of suggested, this talk is based on joint research with Beth Sturman, who is sort of jack of all trades in our department, but also does a lot of work on prosody on her own. She's writing her dissertation on the prosody of quotation and other related things, and she's been an equal partner in the project that I'm talking to you about today. So, the talk is going to be on exclamation intonation, but I'll first sort of back up a little bit and talk to you about mirativity in general. I'm going to use the term to talk about the encoding of implicit speaker surprise or exceeded expectation. And I'm going to unpack this definition and convince you that it's the right one in a few slides from now. It's encoded linguistically using a variety of different strategies, morphological, syntactic, prosodic. We'll focus on the prosody today. And thereby, mirativity must be represented compositionally, and it tends to be. It's not something that you want in the pragmatics. It's a part of the parts in the sort of Phrygian compositional parts in whole. And if you're not convinced of it already, I'll do my best to convince you of that today as well. So for me, mirativity markers pose two broad questions. The first is, what is the semantic contribution of a mirativity marker? And I'll largely be skipping over that part today. I talk about it in a recent paper called The Semantics of Emotive Markers and Other Illocutionary Content. The second question it raises for me is, when mirativity is encoded prosodically, which properties amount to the semantic encoding of mirativity, and which are doing what, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. So today I'm going to first present an elicitation study of prosodic mirative marking, aka exclamation intonation in English. And then I'm going to present a comprehension task that we've just started implementing. So there's a lot of room for your feedback, and we'd really appreciate to get it. And the goal of this comprehension task is to determine the status of the properties that we identify in the elicitation study. And sort of specifically for today, my research questions are English exclamations marked uniformly across the 4 constructions that they come in with uniform prosody? If so, how? How can we represent it semantically? And I won't really be able to touch on this without the comprehension experiment results, but I'm also very much interested in whether or not the prosodic marking of mirativity in English is semantically arbitrary, or which aspects of exclamation intonation are semantically arbitrary in English. And we'll see how far we can get to addressing that question today. So here is the promised slide in which I sort of unpack my definition of mirativity. I use the term mirative as a label for any natural language expression of exceeded expectation. So I take the pair in 1 to be a minimal pair with respect to mirativity. So the first is an assertion, Jane won the race. The second, the sentence exclamation, wow, Jane won the race. So here's what I mean by expression. And I used the term implicit earlier. I sort of mean the same thing. What I'm doing is I'm drawing on this Kaplanian distinction between descriptive content, content that's about the world, and expressive content, content that's about how the utterance is being used. I just heard this beautiful interview with a folk musician today who said that he was singing folk songs that had no meaning, but only emoted. And that's the sort of sense that I mean here. Like any expressive speech act, exclamatives can be uttered, or exclamations can be uttered insincerely. So this example comes from Mott's Ruth. You can imagine back in the day when we were doing things like flying, that there were people who did it all the time and were thereby had just the right expectations for how small the seats on airlines were. But you can nevertheless imagine that person, especially if they were one of those chatty people that you don't want to be sat next to on airplanes. You can imagine them sort of turning to their seat partner and exclaiming, wow, airline seats are so tiny these days. And this is a felicitous use of the exclamation, and it's one in which the speaker is signifying that her expectations about the seats have been violated, but she's doing so insincerely because we know that, as a matter of fact, her expectations have not been violated. So this is just a standard hallmark of expressive speech acts, like promising is the same way. And it's something that that I don't think of as falsified in a claim that miratives mark exceeded or violated expectations on the part of the speaker. We could talk about that in a Q&A if you want to. Like any expressive content, mirativity is not at issue. Which means that the content encoded in a mirative marker is undeniable and non-negatable. So if you say to me, wow, those cupcakes are good, I can use no in a discourse to directly deny the assertive or descriptive content of the sentence exclamation. Namely, I can say, no, they're not. But I cannot use no to deny or address the not at issue mirative expressive component. I can't say something like, no, you knew exactly how good they'd be. So that's about the word expression. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about exceeded expectation. This is a standard phrase in the mirativity literature, so not just about exclamations. And I think it's well put by Delancey when he's talking about mirative evidentials. He said something like, no matter how high my expectations might have been, what I have just heard exceeded them. And I think there's evidence for that this is the right way of characterizing things too. There's just something about expressing an exceeded or a violated expectation that makes that meaning polysemous. It's just, if you say, even explicitly, you did better, this is an explicit expectation violation. You did better than the faculty expected you to. It's just polysemous or ambiguous in a context in which you are charitable and assuming that the faculty had the right expectations for you, ones that are well motivated. You take this as a compliment. But there's a non-charitable reading in which you take it to mean that the faculty had artificially low expectations for your behavior, and you can take it as an insult. So you can imagine the recipient of Eric Clapton's "My Darling, You Look Wonderful Tonight," going like, "Oh, what did you expect? How did you expect me to look?" And that's just a fact of the matter. You know, we can presume cross-linguistically about any sort of communication of exceeded or violated expectation, and this is something that we see with exclamatives as well. I've talked about the speaker's expectation in particular. These are generally speaker-oriented. They don't need to be for in different pragmatic configurations, but we expect that too of speaker-oriented meaning. Some additional evidence that they're generally speaker-oriented: if I embed, insofar as I can embed an exclamation in English under a verb of saying, which I generally can't, but this is true of other constructions as well. It can't orient to the subject, as in 5a. And it doesn't do anything like interrogative flip, insofar as you can put exclamations in questions, which you really can't. But again, I've tested this in other mirative markers and other constructions cross-linguistically, and that's the content of the 2020 paper that I mentioned. Additionally, and we'll talk about this in the next slide as well, some mirativity markers have been explicitly tied to the here and now. So some of the literature uses the word origo for this. It's been reported that some mirative constructions report only novel information to the unprepared mind. Eichenwald describes miratives, evidentials, I believe, as a spontaneous reaction to a new, salient, often surprising event. So this is seen as, this is mentioned as a requirement of some mirative constructions, but arguably not others. So we'll touch on that a little bit too. An aside about the word surprise: there have been other characterizations, mostly of exclamatives, as instead of expressing expectation violation or exceeded expectations, as expressing something like surprise or noteworthiness. And it's really hard to nail this difference down. I'm going to do my best to try today, but you'll see there's still some questions. This is a subtle distinction. But insofar as it's been thought of, we can talk about the difference between exceeded expectation and surprise, in that the former is a stable attitude. If the size of an airline seat exceeded my expectation 5 years ago, the idea is that my expectation has still been exceeded, but I might no longer, in fact, I should no longer be surprised by it. But for reasons I already discussed, this difference breaks down a little bit in insincere uses, as came up in the airline example. The exceeded expectation tends to be used in the broader mirativity literature, although the latter is more applicable to mirative evidentials. So Sarah Murray and I have written on that mirative evidentials need to be uttered, can only be uttered in a context in which you have immediate and direct evidence for the thing. And we argue that this is because it's tied to the tense aspect of a given language. And crucially, exceeded expectation is binary, surprise is gradable, and that's one of the things that I'm going to be using to try and tackle this difference. So it seems possible, this will be my working hypothesis, it seems possible that mirativity markers cross-linguistically, the thing that they encode semantically is exceeded expectation. But other mirative constructions can also come to additionally signify surprise via other means. So conventionalization, you can see this really tight semantic relationship between exceeded expectation and surprise, via tense aspect encoding, which is what Sarah Murray and I have argued is the case for mirative evidentials, and via prosody, which may or may not be the case for English exclamation intonation. We'll see. Just quickly, I've been sort of hinting at all of these other sort of interesting mirative markers cross-linguistically. I'll just review those so we can see the landscape that we're looking at, and the reason why it's so important to have a universal and compositional account of the sememe that is mirativity. There are a variety of different strategies in mirative marking. There are what I call independent miratives, so markers that encode mirativity and only mirativity. And we've seen already, I'll give some examples of the different ways in which that's manifested. And there are two other types, mixed expressive miratives and dependent miratives, and I'll give examples of those in a second. So just crucially, instead of providing a semantics for any given strategy, like people have used the phrase, the semantics of discourse particles before, it doesn't make much sense because discourse particles are so heterogeneous semantically. We should aim to provide semantics for a given unit of meaning. I'll use the term semi. In this case, we're talking about mirativity. And I hope that the data I show today provide a clear need for a compositional semantics of this meaning. It's not a pragmatic phenomenon. Mirativity interacts not just with the proposition it ranges over, but with other properties of its marker. And we'll see that with the mixed expression miratives, or the context, and we'll see that with dependent miratives. So this is my favorite mirative marker. I hate to have favorites, but here it is. In Finnish, we've got the particle pa. So I've got the same mineral pair in 6 as I did in 1 for English. I've just got an assertion in 6a. There are lots of flowers here. In 6b, we've only added pa, but I now have an exclamation or a mirative construction. Wow, there are lots of flowers here. Interestingly, pa can occur anywhere on the sentence that we want it to. It's sort of adverbial-like in that respect, but the meaning difference exactly mirrors the interaction of exclamation, intonation in English and focus. So it's a difference between something like, Sarah baked the bread, Sarah baked the bread, Sarah baked the bread. Those differences, that's the difference in meaning that we get in Finnish when we move around the mirative marker. Mandarin has been reported to have not just mirative adverbials, but anti-mirative adverbials, which I haven't looked anything at. And here's an example of what's been alleged to be syntactic mirative marking. The focus fronting con el director here. And the data is not as complete as it could be, so we can come back and talk about that if you'd like. And of course, we can do it prosodically in English, and we'll talk about that for the rest of the talk. Just quickly, I want to go over some mixed expression miratives. So I use this term to talk about markers that encode mirativity, but they also encode some at-issue content. The most common type is a mirative conjunction, similar to the English lo and behold, insofar as you have that in your dialect at all, which you might not. So Russian has one, so it's akin to saying like he fell ill and lo and behold, he died. There are also expressive intensifiers that are said to encode just whatever the meaning of the word very is, an intensifier meaning at the at-issue level, and then a mirative component at the expressive level, the level that I've been talking about. And then finally, dependent miratives are miratives that mark mirativity, but only in certain configurations, and they mark some other polysemous meaning in a different grammatical configuration. So mirative evidentials are great examples of this. Here's an example from Safiki. We've got an indirect evidential. Mirative evidentials are always indirect evidentials of some sort or another. And that means in a case or a situation in which I have indirect evidence for the proposition, it just effectively marks that indirect evidence. So it means something like it is apparently a motorcycle. But in a circumstance in which I have direct evidence of the motorcycle, it can be used not to mark evidence, but instead to mark that I am surprised that P. And there are additional different languages place their own language-specific grammatical licensing requirements on the mirative reading of a mirative evidential. So in Gitxan, the mirative reading is licensed by the first person. In Hare, it's licensed by the imperfect. Cheyenne by present tense, and Georgian by individual level predicates. There's so much interesting work to be done on what this all means and how it ties into the notion of origo, which it presumably does in some sense or another. So I encourage anyone who wants a fun fieldwork project to dive into mirative evidentials. This is my only semantics slide specifically, and you'll probably be relieved to see there's not any formalism in it, but I just want to quickly review the analysis that I give in Rett 2020, so you have some idea of what I think these things are doing. I analyze mirative markers as what I'm going to start calling semantic non-meaning, in harking back to that folk music, that folk musicians' characterization of folk music as not having meaning, but only emoting. So the idea is we've got non-semantic meaning, i.e. agresian implicative, but there's also semantic non-meaning. So it's something that we are encoding compositionally. We really want to have as one of the parts in our parts and whole notion of a compositional semantics, but it's not contributing any descriptive content. It's not characterizing how the world is. This is meaning that is being used to characterize how the speaker is using the utterance in a context. So most of this paper is devoted to the argument that mirative markers, like other emotive markers, I focus on alas and unfortunately and things like that. Sure, they encode not at issue content insofar as the content they encode isn't directly negatable or deniable and so forth, but it's a particular sort of not at issue content. And it's importantly different from content that's not at issue that we think of as canonical not at issue content. So that encoded in appositives or evidential adverbs like apparently. This is descriptive at issue, not at issue content. It talks about what the world is. But I argue that emotive markers and in another paper, expressives, are really doing something differently. So specifically, this is how I model it. I model it in just the Farkas and Bruce dynamic update framework. While canonical not at issue content directly updates the common grounds, so this is sort of the scoreboard that we use to sort of keep track of what our mutual beliefs are for the purpose of the conversation. Illocutionary not at issue content, and this is mirativity and other things, modifies the user's discourse commitment, which is something that's been innovated formally to talk about something like speaker bias in things like rising declaratives, like is that a persimmon, or that's a persimmon. But I find it useful for modeling this sort of speaker-oriented, non-descriptive content as well. I argue in this paper that this difference, this formal difference, can account for the different behaviors of emotive markers relative to the other canonical not at issue markers. Specifically, I show that emotive markers can trigger Moore's paradox, but other not at issue markers can't. And then emotive markers can only range over a single proposition in their scope, where other not at issue markers can range over other propositions or more than one. Okay, so that's just the prelude. Now I'm going to turn to the main content of the talk, which is an investigation of exactly what exclamation intonation looks like and what the ramifications are for the semantic account that I've outlined. So I'm going to do a sort of background for those of you like myself who don't have a prosody background, so hopefully it won't be too boring for those of you who are experts. Here I am talking to you about how we need to represent this stuff semantically. You can tell I feel quite passionately about it. But there's a lot of previous work on the semantics of prosody. We know that prosody can mark illocutionary mood. This is something that we'll be talking about again today. It can mark orientation, so orientation to the user or the addressee. But we know it can mark other content like uncertainty and incredulity. And our claim today is that English exclamation intonation is similarly multifaceted, and that it can mark something like this mirativity, illocutionary content that I've just been talking about, as well as secondary effects like surprise or emphasis. All right, so let's get down and dirty into English exclamation intonation. So there are 4 constructions in English that qualify as exclamations. We've already seen sentence exclamation. It's just the same syntax as a declarative sentence, but we've got a different prosody on it. And then there are 3 exclamatives, and this term is reserved for exclamations that have non-declarative word order or non-declarative syntax. So there is in 14a a WH exclamative, in 14b an inversion exclamative, and in 14c a nominal or a definite exclamative. Crucially, and we tested this as you'll see to make sure, but the discourse particles are optional. I've put them here in parentheses accordingly. It's not the discourse particle that's marking mirativity in English, it's really just the prosody. But the discourse particle, and you'll see quantitative evidence for this, is doing something to bolster at some point the prosody, but we can have just a successful exclamation intonation prosody without it. Crucially, exclamatives are different from the sentences or the constructions that look similar to them. So for instance, WH exclamatives are distinct from constituent questions and even rhetorical questions like, how cool is that? At the very least, these questions have subject-aux inversion, whereas WH exclamatives don't have subject-aux inversion. And I've argued elsewhere that there's a semantic difference between exclamatives and sentence exclamation, in that exclamatives are effectively a degree construction, and that the object of surprise needs to be a degree instead of a proposition, but that won't come into play today. So just a background on prosody. In English, utterances are associated with varying intonational contours, which we call tunes. And these tunes are composed of one or more intermediate phrases, each of which has a pitch accent, at least one. And you can see this example below. Pitch accents mark emphasis using intensity, segment articulation, and pitch targets. Pitch accents are composed of one or more pitch targets with the star anchored to the stressed syllable, and that stressed syllable is perceived as more prominent. We're going to be annotating all of our data today in Maytobi, which is the way it's done. Maytobi takes advantage of the fact, it sort of encodes English as having two primitive post-lexical tones, high and low, and uses these to combine to form 5 pitch accent types. And you'll see that's the main discussion that we'll be having today. But this also plays a crucial role. Maytobi is incomplete from the point of view of the sort of vast landscape of prosody. There's no notation of pitch range, which is to say of where in the speaker's range the tune occurs. And there's some other things that are hard to see. So we're going to take advantage of this difference for our comprehension task. Just a bit more about intermediate phrases, because these play a role for us as well. There are 2 levels of prosodic phrasing above the word, intermediate phrases and intonational phrases. Each intonational phrase contains at least one intermediate phrase, and each intermediate phrase contains at least one pitch accent. Each of these phrases has a final boundary tone, and the final pitch accent in an intermediate phrase is known as the nuclear pitch accent, and is perceived as more prominent. So effectively, the take-home message, if your eyes are sort of glazing over, is that the more phrases you have, the more pitch accents you have, and thereby the more prominence you get. And that's what we see, we're going to end up seeing in sentence exclamations. And just for those of you who are paying attention to the prosodic details, we're going to be distinguishing intermediate phrases insofar as they have their own pitch accents with a stressed syllable, their own phrase accent with final lengthening. And we'll be looking for something like a pitch range reset, which is a new high after a down step, a new ceiling. So here, I'm going to give you an example of a single utterance spoken 2 ways with one intermediate phrase and then 2. And so you'll get a feel for what it means to have more than one intermediate phrase. So here is a question. Can I get some thumbs up to make sure that we've heard everything properly? You can just do a thumb. Paul, you're saying no? Did you hear it?
No, I could not hear it.
I'm going to do it one more time, see if this helps. No?
I hear it very faint, like very, very faintly. But
I'm going to take off these. I think this will help. Let me try one more time.
Does the governor of Iowa endorse a radio program?
Better? Okay, great. We'll do it that way. Thanks, guys. Okay, so you've heard it a few times now, or some of you perhaps. We've got one utterance here with one intermediate phrase. It's just a L*H minus H%.
Does the governor of Iowa endorse a radio program?
This use of the question is, I think, most natural in a situation in which the question under discussion is which governors endorse a radio program. In contrast, you can utter this exact same sentence with 2 intermediate phrases.
Does the governor of Iowa endorse a radio program?
And every time I hear it, my head sort of bobs up and down for each intermediate phrase. And that's sort of what we mean by like a peak and this sort of heightened prominence that you get with this pitch accent. I'll just sort of note that this 3 here is the pitch, the the boundary tone. And that's one of the things that we're looking for when we're looking for different intermediate phrases. We look and see for a boundary tone like this. I'm going to play it one more time. This version of the question is most natural out of the blue.
Does the governor of Iowa endorse a radio program?
Or a situation in which you're looking for like a pair list situation where you're asking both about Iowa or governors and radio programs. Okay, so that's intermediate phrases that'll play a role, but there's also different canonical tunes or pitch accents that are associated with different illocutionary moods. So this will be review for a lot of you, but this is something we know about pitch accents. They're used, at least in English, to differentiate between types of illocutionary types. So we've got declarative sentences with an H star L minus L%.
Miriam made the lemonade.
Sounds like it's falling. We're going from high to low. We've got L star H minus H% for polar questions and the rising declaratives that I mentioned before.
Miriam made the lemonade.
Right, so this is, we're used to seeing middle pairs like this in English. We've got
Miriam
one.
made the lemonade.
It's a statement. Another.
Miriam made the lemonade.
It's a question. That's a difference in illocutionary content, and that's something that we encode prosodically in English. Finally, you've got other tones like H star H minus H%. It's not an exact minimal pair, but we can use this as a confirmation question or a rising imperative.
Make the lemonade.
All right, so this is something we know about pitch accents. It's something we'll see in this as well. But pitch accents have also been associated with perlocutionary effects. So falling intonation has been associated with authoritativeness or assertion, a level intonation with annoyance, rising intonation with politeness or positivity, as in hedging. And pitch range as well, so something like extra high targets, which we'll also be looking at, has also been associated with perlocutionary effects like incredulity. So that's something to keep in mind for exclamation intonation as well. Here I am just repeating my research questions. We want to figure out whether exclamations in English are marked with uniform prosody across the four constructions. I'll admit, as a naive, prosodically naive semanticist, I thought they all sounded wildly different to me, but that was very naive, as you'll see. If so, how are they marked? What are those properties? How can we represent that semantically? And then I'm also curious about the arbitrariness, and we'll look at that at the end. So here's the elicitation task. We had two consultants, one male, one female. We gave them a 4x2 stimuli, the 4 constructions we saw, and we did a plus or minus discourse particle. So some of them were wow and some of them weren't. The result was that there were 32 items per condition, but it was between subjects. So we had 128 per subject. So here are 2 different conditions. You can see all the 4 constructions here, and then we varied the wow. So just for instance, you didn't expect Julian to make beautiful paintings, but you find out you did. He did. You tell Sarah, wow, Julian makes beautiful paintings. Wow, what beautiful paintings Julian makes. Wow, does Julian make beautiful paintings? Wow, the beautiful paintings Julian makes. And crucially, we asked our consultants to read the context in their head and then pronounce out loud the stimulus as it seemed most natural in that context. We designed our fillers to look to be as close counterparts to the various exclamation constructions as we could. So we had declarative sentences, we had WH questions for the WH exclamatives, polar questions for the inversion exclamatives, and definite subjects or clefs for the nominal exclamatives. So you can see that here. As I mentioned, consultants were instructed to read the sentences that they'd be naturally uttered in the provided context, but we did not provide any context for the fillers. And the recordings were transcribed in Prot using Maytobi by one of the authors, not me, crucially, and confirmed by another trained transcriber. So here are the results. I'll present these in 2 slides. We had 3 main effects or main results. Both consultants consistently pronounced all of the exclamations across the board with L plus H star pitch accents. And these percentages are quite high. You can see them here. This first table represents our female consultant, and then the second, our male consultant. 92% of across the board, these are the different 4 configurations: sentence, exclamation, WH, inversion, and nominal, were pronounced with L plus H star pitch accents. So this isn't just counting the stimuli, this is counting the different pitch accents within the stimuli. So there are more than one, as you'll see. And with the related H star being second, but with much lower. And you'll see that proportion is even higher for the male subject. Sorry, this is in your way. Trying to get rid of that. Can you see this bar here? Yeah, okay, I'm trying to get rid of it. There we go. So we've got an even higher, effectively, virtually all are pronounced with L plus H star. And then the second result is that both consultants consistently pronounced exclamations with extra high targets. So a high target is one that exceeds expected height in the range given its position. So for instance, whether it's after a down step. And we define extra high targets as targets that exceed the speaker's default pitch maximum by at least 5%. So effectively what we did was we looked at all of the high targets for a given speaker. We found a range. We identified, this is in the fillers, sorry. We identified the maximum and we determined which one of those exceeded the maximum by 5%. And we got a great many of them. So this is a percentage, the proportion of items with at least one extra high target in one of their pitch accents. So we got a lot of them, regardless of the wow. This is one of the examples where you can see this sort of confusing, the mixed result of the effect of the discourse particle. So it has no effect, it appears on the sentence exclamation, at least with respect to extra high targets. It seems to increase extra high targets, its presence seems to increase extra high targets in the WH exclamatives, but decrease them in the nominal exclamatives. So there's a little more to look into, but we certainly wouldn't get a main effect. We hadn't run statistics, but we certainly wouldn't expect a main effect of discourse particle cross constructions. Finally, our third property that we've identified is that sentence exclamations in English were pronounced with inserted or additional intermediate phrase boundaries. So we got more intermediate phrases than the fillers. So what this amounts to is that we had additional mid-sentence pitch range resets, additional nuclear pitch accents relative to the fillers. And as a consequence, no surprise, words in the exclamations sounded more prominent than ones in their filler counterparts. So I'm going to give you some examples. Here's a sentence exclamation.
Angelique bakes delicious desserts.
Here we've got two intermediate phrases. You can see the intermediate boundary here. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 L plus H star pitch accents.
Angelique bakes delicious desserts.
In this WH exclamative, we've got 1, 2, 3 L plus H star pitch accents.
What delicious desserts Angelique bakes.
Here's an inversion exclamative. We've got 1, 2, 3 intermediate phrases, and we've got a bunch of L plus H star pitch accents all crammed together in this one utterance.
Wow, does Angelique bake delicious desserts?
I'll do it one more time.
Wow, does Angelique bake delicious desserts?
And then finally, the nominal exclamative. We've got 3, 1, 2, 3 intermediate phrases again, and the same number of L plus H star pitch accents.
Wow, the delicious desserts Angelique bakes.
So the idea is that these intermediate phrases are giving us more peaks, and that amounts to prominence, but also the peaks, by virtue of the fact that we've seen increased extra high targets, the peaks are higher than we would expect them to be as well. Okay, I will say something about my naive, as a semanticist, impression that they involve different contours or tunes before. There is a bit of difference in the way these three common properties are manifested across the 4 constructions we looked at. So we see all of these properties in all of the constructions, but they're not sufficient for describing the intonational contour of the 4 constructions we're looking at. So each construction seems to manifest all 3 properties differently to form a unique construction-specific tune. For instance, they differ in their macro rhythm and in what types of words get marked as prominent. So we're not seeing something like the degree words are always marked as prominent, or the subjects are always marked as prominent. We're seeing quite a great deal of syntactic variation. So we suppose, we're hypothesizing that intonation is functioning in this sort of differentiating respect to maximally differentiate each exclamation type from its non-exclamation counterpart. So what you do when you manifest these three properties in a sentence exclamation is you try and sort of distinguish them prosodically as much as possible from a simple declarative, or the WH exclamative from the WH question, and so forth. So for instance, we'll see cases in which the intonational pattern manifested in the exclamation version is complete opposite of the WH, or of the non-exclamation counterpart. So in WH questions, WH phrases lack prominence, but in WH exclamatives, they're the most prominent. In polar questions, the prominent material is at the valley, but in inversion exclamatives, the prominent material is at the peak. So I'll just give you two examples of this. Here's WH question intonation. We've got a question, H star L minus L%. The WH word, crucially, is not prosodically prominent, which is kind of surprising given its discourse significance. So here's what that sounds like.
What does Greta know how to do?
All right, so you hear that peak here, and then we get a low. Crucially, in WH exclamations, the WH word is highly prominent. It's marked with its own L plus H star, nearly 88% of the time. And the WH word target is extra high most of the time. So here's that.
What delicious desserts Angelique bakes?
So this isn't a perfect minimal pair by any means, but I'll just do them side by side.
What does Greta know how to do? What delicious desserts Angelique bakes?
All right, and then we'll do one more example, the polar question intonation. Again, the canonical tune is L star H minus H%, with L star being the least acoustically salient of the pitch accents. And the pitch accents in polar questions are relatively sparse, with the result being a relatively slow macro rhythm frequency. So we don't get the highs and lows that we see in exclamations. So here's what that sounds like.
Did Yolanda hear that the restaurant is closing? Did Yolanda hear that the restaurant is closing?
So slow macro rhythm, not lots of ups and downs, and we contrast that with the fast macro rhythm.
Wow, does Angelique bake delicious desserts?
So I'm doing my head bob a lot more for this one than I am for the other one. And there's also a difference in terms of what's prominent relative to the other exclamations. All right, so we've seen these three prosodic properties. We've got pitch accent, we've got extra high targets, and we've got additional intermediate phrases. So my question as a semanticist, I'm looking to plug these results into my compositional semantics. My question is, which of these properties are semantically arbitrary and which are non-arbitrary? So for instance, it seems as though the L plus H pitch accent might be semantically arbitrary. It's used elsewhere in English, for instance, for prosodic focus marking. But it's an open question. I'm not sure what, if anything, extra high targets and additional intermediate phrases signify in English or other languages. And a related question, which of these three prosodic properties count as English's mirativity marker? I'm assuming there's only one because that's what we sort of come to expect in a compositional semantics. And we've got three properties here. So my biggest question right now is what to do with these three, which to plug into my mirativity marking semantics and which to think of else as some other way and why. So of the three, only pitch accent has been historically associated with semantic meaning or illocutionary meaning, or something that we are using to change the meaning. And of the three, only pitch accent is categorical. So crucially, if I think of the meaning of mirativity as signifying expectation violation or exceeded expectation, then I really want something to be categorical. It's either exceeded or it's not. And pitch accent is the only one that is categorical in that respect. So our working hypothesis right now is that it's the pitch accent that signifies mirativity marking in English. And the other two prosodic properties that we've identified, the extra high targets and the additional intermediate phrases, are doing something else, maybe marking surprise or something perlocutionary or something gradient. And what we want to do with our comprehension study is to try and figure out exactly what the other two properties are doing. In the study I'm going to end showing you, we're going to to try and isolate the effects of extra high targets to answer these questions. So in this comprehension task, which we are about to start running, we're sort of waiting for this talk to see what you guys think. We've got within subject conditions, we've got the same 4 constructions you're used to, but now we've got a condition that's plus or minus extra high targets. So the plus extra high stimuli are just the male speaker's stimuli from study 1. But we've created some minus extra high stimuli that we did by getting a male speaker who's trained in Toby to just read the Toby annotation of the male speaker's stimuli from study 1. So recall that Toby doesn't mark things like relative height of pitch accents or pitch targets. It only sort of, not only, but it marks pitch accent, but doesn't do things like say, this is a really high target, or even what the height of the target is. So what we did for this condition was we just asked someone to read the Toby annotation with the expectation that we would get the pitch accent, but none of the other 2 properties. So, or sorry, not the extra high targets. So we wouldn't get anything like the particularly high prominence. And then we are running it to have a between subject condition in terms of how to characterize mirativity. So what we're doing is we're presenting these 3 statements and giving subjects a 1 to 7 Likert scale about the extent to which they agree with these statements. So for instance, for the exclamation, wow, Julian makes beautiful paintings, we would say, Julian makes beautiful paintings. That was not expected by the speaker. Our intention is that this is the best way of testing something like exceeded expectation. And then Julian makes beautiful paintings. That's surprising to the speaker, insofar as this is divorceable from the sort of exceeded expectation characterization of mirativity. We're wondering about the extent to which that will diverge. And then finally, one that seems a little more perlocutionary. Julian makes beautiful paintings. That is exciting to the speaker. I'm just going to try and see whether surprise trends more like exciting or trends more like a lack of expectation. And then for every stimuli, we're asking how acceptable is this utterance on a scale of 1 to 10. So here, let me show you what these sound like. So here is the plus extra high targets that we got as natural utterances in context.
Diana's stories are creative.
Here's the Toby annotation reading.
Diana's stories are creative.
How creative Diana's stories are.
How creative Diana's stories are.
Can Diana tell creative stories?
Can Diana tell creative stories?
The creativeness of Diana's stories.
The creativeness of Diana's stories.
And then just to remind you, after we ask her about acceptability, we'll say something like, Diana's stories are creative. That one condition was not expected by the speaker. Another condition is surprising to the speaker. Another condition is exciting to the speaker. And we've got the same fillers.
Anna is good at chess.
And for the fillers, we're asking things like Anna is or might be good at chess. That is disappointing or interesting to the speaker. So, in terms of predictions, insofar as we have any, we're going to be taking for granted, for better or worse, that L plus H star pitch accent is effectively our semantically encoded mirativity marker. And then the question is, what is it that extra high targets are doing for us in English? So one hypothesis is that extra high targets make no meaningful contribution. It's just a sort of unlikely hypothesis, but the idea is that it's not doing any heavy lifting in the mirative construction. If this were the case, we'd expect effectively no difference between the 2 speaker conditions, the plus or minus extra high targets, across the construction conditions with respect to the exceeded expectation or the surprise or the excited questions. And then similarly, no difference with respect to acceptability. Second hypothesis is that extra high targets are an optional expressive marker, the sort of perlocutionary meaning that I've been getting at, meaning that it sort of expresses surprise or excitement in a gradient way on top of the core semantic mirative meaning. If this was the case, we think, expect effectively no difference between speaker conditions with respect to unexpectedness. So that we've got the pitch accents there. So everyone's going to say they agree that the speaker did not expect that P. But we'd expect some difference between speaker conditions of plus or minus extra high targets with respect to surprise and excitement, with of course the plus extra high targets yielding higher ratings. And perhaps some difference in acceptability as well. Maybe it seems a little infelicitous or insincere to utter a mirative exclamation without sounding surprised. If this was the case, then we'd expect the plus extra high targets to sound higher. And we'd expect these main effects, so that there might be some differences across constructions. I didn't finish this hypothesis. Extra high targets are, pitch is a semantic mirative marker, and extra high targets are also. If this was the case, we'd expect a notable difference between speaker conditions, with the minus extra high targets yielding lower ratings across the board. So for acceptability, for exceeded expectations, surprise, and excitement. So that's a comprehension task as we've set it up. You know, there's a lot of stuff here that's uncharted territory. So I'm anxious to sort of get your opinion on what that sounds like. But again, what our goal is to sort of try and take these three properties that we've identified across the board on these exclamation constructions and try and figure out which one we want to plug into our compositional semantics. Ideally, it would only be the one. That seems like the best working hypothesis. And also we're sort of taking for granted that it might be the pitch accent and trying to figure out what at least extra high targets are doing to help. So in summary, mirativity is encoded, as we've seen, morphologically or syntactically or prosodically, and it's encoded either independently or in congruence with other meaning or polysemously with other meaning. And it seems best to characterize it as signifying a violation of the speaker's expectation, but some mirative constructions have also been associated with a sort of more origo here and now speaker surprise. Mirativity, as I've argued in this other paper, encodes illocutionary not at issue content. It amounts to semantic non-meaning. It's doing something compositionally that we want to represent compositionally, but it's not describing the world. It's talking about how the speaker is using the utterance in context. And finally, the results of the elicitation task show that all exclamations, at least in English, are pronounced with L plus H star pitch accents, extra high targets, and the addition of intermediate phrase boundaries. In terms of prosodically marked mirativity, there's a clear established role in the semantics for L plus H star pitch accent that we find in English exclamations. As I've said before, there's other evidence that pitch accents operate at the illocutionary level. And you know, for what it's worth, that's sort of been the going hypothesis up until these experiments. But there's an open question of what to do with the other prosodic components of mirativity marking. I find it intuitive to think that there's something non-arbitrary about the use of extra high and additional targets to signify surprise or unexpectedness. And we're going to conduct this comprehension task accordingly. But there's also a very clear need here for looking at the prosodic properties of mirative, explicitly sort of morphologically marked mirative constructions cross-linguistically. I've been told that mirative evidentials in Cheyenne and the PA construction in Finnish do not need to have any sort of additional special prosody to mark mirativity, but it's an open question of whether or not they tend to, and if so, what that sort of prosody contributes. All right, thanks so much.